They were raised by doting parents who told them they were special, played in little leagues with no winners or losers or all winners. They're laden with trophies just for participating.
But as a generation, they are way behind. They're deeper in debt, only half as likely to own a home, and more likely to live in poverty than their parents.
When I was trying to buy my first home, I wasn't buying. Smashed avocados for 19 bucks.
The tired stereotypes about how much millennials love fancy breakfast foods are just a very convenient way to obscure all of the real systemic reasons why so many of these big traditional adult milestones, like home ownership, are not so accessible to us.
When I asked my larger friend group about plans for getting married, buying a house, or having a kid, many of them straight up laughed at me.
This new generation, scarred by the financial crisis, is saving more than the free-spending boomers did before them.
To me, 2017 was a year that the online meme, in many ways a defining tool of the millennial generation, surpassed traditional media. It was the year that living meme Donald Trump was sworn in as the 45th President of the United States, a presidency in which he would routinely bypass mainstream media.
I'm not going to give you a question. You are fake news.
Choosing instead to take to Twitter to preach directly to his followers without moderation. 2017 also saw the release of Louis Fonsi and Daddy Yankee's hit song Despacito, which would go on to become the year's best-selling and most streamed single. This was in one part thanks to platforms like Spotify and YouTube hosting the song, and another to the internet memeing the ever-living shit out of it.
So, Alexa, play Despacito 5.
Quickly making the song one of the most overused jokes online. And finally, 2017 was the year that Tim Gurner would say some really dumb shit in a television interview about millennials, money, and breakfast.
When I was trying to buy my first home, I wasn't buying. Smashed avocados for 19 bucks.
This probably would have gone unnoticed, had it not been for its circulation online, which would temporarily make him one of the most accessible punchlines for young people with an internet connection. So what the fuck is a Tim Gurner? Well, you know that meme about how millennials can't afford anything because they seemingly spend all of their money on breakfast food? You can thank our boy Tim for that one. See, in early 2017, he appeared in a 60 Minutes piece on Australia's housing problem. And during that interview, infamously told young people to stop whinging and start saving.
When I had my first business when I was 19, I was in the gym at 6 a.m. in the morning and I finished at 10:30 at night, and I did it 7 days a week. And I did it till I could afford my first home. And there was no discussions around could I go out for breakfast or could I go out for dinner or whatever it was. I just worked.
Like I said, some real dumb shit. But look, while Tim didn't do himself any favours in making himself one of the most easy targets to dunk on,
Buckets!
It should be noted that he wasn't the only one, let alone the first, to push these ideas in mainstream media, that millennials can't afford anything because they spend all their money on breakfast. See, about 6 months earlier, a column making almost the exact same assertion appeared in Australia's biggest newspaper, which, just a quick aside, is called The Australian. Just an absolute creative genius of a name. Fucking alright, you do better then. Anyway, the column was originally titled The Evils of the Hipster Cafe, and was written by Bernard Salt, an author and demographer. Oh, well, that clears that up. I have seen young people order smashed avocado with crumbled feta on 5 grain toasted bread at $22 a pop and more. $22 several times a week could go towards a deposit on a house. Now, similar to Tim, old Bernard received a fair bit of backlash after his article was first published. Granted, it tended to come more from traditional media rather than social media, but the fool was still clowned on.
What kind of idiot is paying $22 for avocado on toast? Are you out of your mind? Have you lost your gourd? What is wrong with you, Bernard?
It wasn't long until analysis was conducted just to prove the fallacy of the statement. The real estate conversation created its avocado index, which showed how many years a person would have to spend eating avocado on toast for it to equal an average home in different parts of Australia. And so it became pretty clear, pretty quickly, that expenses like avocado on toast and coffee wasn't the real reason that many millennials couldn't afford to buy their own home. But before we get too far into that, I do want to give both of our boys a bit of a chance, because both Tim and Bernard say they were taken out of context. In the years since Bernard Salt's column was first published, he's claimed that he was actually trying to make fun of middle-aged people, rather than chastise the youth.
So it was done as a parody of the conservatism of middle-aged people. Someone on Twitter took just those lines saying Bernard Salt said,
of course, yeah.
Look at these young people eating smash, shouldn't they be saving for a house? What do you think about this? There's no need to look at the context to see whether it was a parody or whatever. And then it went off like wildfire.
Bullshit. Excuse me. Jokes aside, Bernard's article was tongue-in-cheek. But at the end of the day, he wrote those words, likely knowing the derision it would cause and the controversy that it would stir up. I'm much more sympathetic towards Tim, and not just because of his fucked hairline. He definitely had less of a say in how his interview was going to be edited, and therefore perceived. In a follow-up interview, Tim said that he was actually trying to encourage financial responsibility among young people. And when you watch the interview in its entirety, you can actually see this.
So what you're saying is you're a bit more driven than some of the people in the current generation?
Look, I wouldn't say that they're not driven. I just think that the media and the current environment and lifestyle changes has definitely changed the next generation. I think it's very dangerous. I think the problem with this generation is they want the 3-bedroom home in Melbourne and Melbourne East and Prahran and Alexandra and Sydney, and it's just not sustainable or realistic.
Now, something else that Tim brought up in that follow-up interview was that a lack of housing affordability obviously couldn't be blamed on the millennial generation. It's something that he actually discussed in that original 60 Minutes piece. However, government incentives needed for massive transfer of wealth between generations just doesn't have the same ring to it as Millionaire tells millennials to go fuck themselves, which is unfortunate because I think it's a really important point and one that is usually lost.
The only thing that gives me a little bit of comfort is the fact that parents have inherited gigantic wealth. The baby boomers have gone and we have created this incredible wealth throughout the baby boomers. Everyone's talking about affordability and housing crises and unaffordability. The realistic fact is there is this incredible amount of wealth that has been created and is sitting with the baby boomers that will be passed down. There is going to be a transition of wealth in the next 20 to 30 years, which will see a lot of these people be able to buy their own home. But I think some sort of measure now, some sort of government incentive to encourage parents to be able to pass down money earlier, I think would be a great thing.
Now, however they spin it, or however you personally choose to interpret what Tim and Bernard have said, at the end of the day, it can't be denied that they did achieve something with their comments. See, a week after Bernard's column first appeared in The Australian, questions were asked in the Australian Parliament about housing affordability in this country. Meanwhile, Tim's comments and the discourse that it created helped to shine a spotlight on the wealth gap that was deepening between older and younger generations worldwide. The cost of living in Australia and the United States has risen drastically over the last 30 years, almost faster than the average wage can keep up. In fact, if you're under 35 and living in Australia, it's very likely that your wage hasn't gone up. For the first time in a century, those aged between 15 and 35 are earning less today than what they would have been 10 years ago. Which means personally, I was considered more valuable to society when I chemically straightened my hair and wore shuffle pants. In a similar way to wages, the average wealth of a household headed by someone aged 35 or under hasn't changed since 2004. i.e., young people are at best stagnant, but much more likely, just like me circa 2009, moving backwards. Then there are the prices of houses themselves. Since the 1970s, the prices of houses in Australia have gone from being about 4 times the average salary to between 10 and 20 times the average salary, depending on which part of the country you're wanting to buy in. And finally, there are the economic impacts. Many millennials graduated from high school and university into the worst economy since the Great Depression. For many, this meant trying to find a job in a market where there were just no jobs.
Recessions, while terrible for most everyone, are particularly awful for those just entering the job market.
I had this idea and this dream and this vision of where my life was going to go, and then I had to put it on hold.
For a lot of millennials, particularly in the US, this took a long time to recover from. In some cases, more than 10 years, which is particularly unfortunate because in early 2020, they were slapped with yet another recession, this time in the form of the Big C.
Nearly a decade later, as many of these folks are getting back onto their feet and getting back onto a career trajectory that maybe they expected to be on 5 years ago, they're getting hit again.
And so with all of this in mind, it really shouldn't be that surprising then that a report by the Grattan Institute found that despite stereotypes, young people today are spending less on discretionary items like recreation, travel, and clothing, and more on essential goods like housing and food compared to their parents 30 years prior.
Young people today spend less of their income on everything, from transport to clothing, even avocado on toast.
And now for the kicker. Because while these trends have worked against young people, they've worked overwhelmingly in the favour of those that are older. That same Grattan Institute report found that older Australians today spend more, have higher incomes, and greater wealth than what their parents did 3 decades earlier. Fucking new dad could afford to get me that Tamagotchi. So where did all this wealth come from? Well, to begin with, when baby boomers were around the same age as what millennials are today, when adjusted for inflation, on average they earned about 20% more. Meanwhile, from an economic standpoint, everything that I've said about millennials, the inverse is true for baby boomers and Gen Xers. In relation to their income, expenses like health and education were far more affordable. And while lower expenses and higher incomes definitely helped these generations, particularly when it came to being able to save more, there was one thing in particular that skyrocketed their wealth: housing. Because when millennials are having to fork out larger and larger sums of cash just to have a place that they can call their own, who do you think is on the other side of that transaction? But hey, if you still have doubts about whether there is a divide in the wealth between older and younger generations, then perhaps I should just shut the fuck up and let this graph do the talking for me. Currently in the US, the millennial generation holds 3% of the country's total wealth. When they were roughly the same age, baby boomers held 27%. Now this essentially represents the breaking of a social contract that's been in place for about the last century. See, throughout history, there's been an implicit promise that every new generation will be slightly better off than the one that came before it. When Tim Gurner's Smash Davo comments blew up, older Australians latched onto them. They used it as an opportunity to talk about their own sacrifices, as well as the hard work that went into being able to buy their own home and grow their wealth. But I haven't seen as many older people talk about those other comments that Gurner made. Now, I'm not going to rag on older generations or show you a bunch of okay boomer memes, as tempting as that would be, because many individuals in that generation did work hard, and I don't want to discredit that. Hell, take my dad for instance. He was a migrant from Switzerland with limited qualifications, and he worked damn hard to educate himself when he got to Australia to make sure that his young family's needs were being met. But it should be said that millennials are working just as hard.
Great stuff. Now let's get my name in a circle around your nipple.
What the fuck?
It's just that unlike those who came before us, the odds are not in our favour, and for many of us, likely won't ever be. So, are millennials bad with money? Nah, I don't think so. It's pretty clear that we've been dealt a shit hand. Our wages are going backwards, our wealth is stagnant, and all around us the cost of living, at least on essentials, continues to rise. But just because you're not bad at something doesn't mean you're good at it. Trust me, I know your mum. And if those street fashion videos are anything to go by, we could clearly be better with our money. A US study by the George Washington University found that only a quarter of millennial participants had sought advice on saving and investing, while only 1/10 of participants had sought advice on how to manage their debts. It's up to us to learn what to do with the little we have. It's not our fault, but it is our responsibility. And I know that it can be boring. I mean, why do you think I made jokes about Timbo's hairline? This stuff can be drier than poor Bernard's wife. But unfortunately, regardless of how interesting you find personal finance, it is important, especially if you're a millennial. And now, a cringy poem. Good financial habits and saying no to unnecessary debt can help you avoid living from paycheck to paycheck. Taking the time to learn how to invest in property, stocks, perhaps an ETF, using compound interest to beat inflation instead of just relying on your superannuation will guide you towards financial independence. Because doesn't retiring early just make more sense? What I'm trying to say is no matter what cards you've been dealt, these tools are the way in which you'll build wealth. Are you impressed that I memorized that whole thing? I wouldn't be. It's a day wasted. And while the abundance of personal finance related content on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok does have some issues, I think the popularity of the subject shows that we are on the right track. Because at the end of the day, we all work hard for our money. And if we want to, we should be able to drink coffee or eat smashed avo on toast, comfortably knowing that it's not going to cost us our future.